to episode 166 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Andrew Swafford,
Nathan Smith.
And in today's episode, we will be talking about movies we saw this week. And in part 2, we will be continuing our October horror series with 1992's Candyman. But let's go ahead and get into stuff that we saw this week. Well, it's not really this week, because as we alluded to in the last episode, we're recording this on the same day as we recorded last week's episode. But regardless, let's stick with the
movies
format.
we saw exactly 1 week ago.
Yeah. Andrew and I, we both watched this movie. It just was recently released on Netflix. It is the latest in what is probably the 1500th Stephen King adaptation from this year.
Approximately 1500th.
I swear to God, there's been so many. It is Gerald's Game. And it stars Carla Gugino and Bruce Greenwood, and it's directed and written by Mike Flanagan, who did Hush. And one of the Ouija movies, or
Ouija 2, Origin of Evil.
Yeah, which is a good movie.
Yeah, and this one is based on a little known Stephen King story where this married couple go off to their remote lake house for a weekend of passion and love and solitude, and while they're trying to spice up their marriage in the bedroom, he decides to handcuff her to the bed, and while they're getting, talking, kind of getting into, the acts of lovemaking, he has...
Way to tiptoe around that. The acts of lovemaking.
He has a heart attack and leaves her to fight for her own survival while she's handcuffed to the bed. And there's a lot of other stuff that happens. I think maybe we can get into it if we want to get spoilery. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I wasn't a giant fan of this movie, but I know you really didn't like it, Andrew.
No, and I haven't seen Ouija 2, Origin of Evil, and I am trusting you, Nathan, that it very well might be good. But I am not...
It's the good version of the Conjuring movies.
Okay, well, the Conjuring movies are the good version of the Conjuring movies. But regardless, I'm not a fan of Mike Flanagan, having watched Gerald's Game and Hush. I know a lot of people are heralding this guy as one of the greatest horror directors of our moment. I think he... Just basing it off one of those two movies, one of the most distasteful to me. Hush is a movie that I was lukewarm towards at the time, and having watched Gerald's Game, I've now realized that I'd probably hate it. And Hush and Gerald's Game have a lot in common, which is they take the climax of a horror movie and they stretch them out for the entire runtime of a horror movie. And Zach, I know you were praising Dawn of the Dead for starting on like the third act of your typical horror movie and going from there. But the difference is that Dawn of the Dead goes from there. It extrapolates upon where you're at in that moment in a horror movie, and it continues the story from that place. Hush and Gerald's Game both just find these two characters in a state of distress, completely, left to their own devices and having little to no protection over their own bodies, and just makes them subject to acts of horrendous violence for the entire runtime of the film. Gerald's Game is not as violent as Hush.
Well, and it's violent. Sorry to interrupt, but it's kind of like gruesome physical violence, but then also kind of really deep, disturbing,
psychological, sexual violence too. Gerald's Game works differently than Hush because you have a character who's literally confined. Hush is a deaf woman who's being hunted by a slasher from outside of her house, so there's a lot of movement and there's a lot of action. There's really no plot or character development. It's just like, will she or won't she get killed by this guy? And in Gerald's Game, because you have somebody who's tied up, nothing can really happen other than there's this threat of a bloodthirsty dog that may or may not eat her over the course of the film. It is her psychologically reeling and reliving traumatic events of her childhood and her past. And it just doesn't work as a movie or a story for me. It just feels very exploitative. I do not think that the way that it handles sexual violence towards women is in any way like progressive or empathetic. It's just kind of using it as a plot device, it feels like to me. And the basic failing from my perspective is just bad storytelling. There's no real arc here. There's no real narrative that's being presented. It's just kind of flashback after flashback and manifestations of this woman's thoughts materializing in front of her and explaining her own thoughts to her. Zach, you came up with a great term while we were watching this movie, which is king-splaining, which is where Stephen King shows up to explain the movie to you. And that is what almost the entire runtime of Gerald's Game is. It's either something very horrifying or traumatic happening to this woman, or someone literally showing up to explain how she is feeling to her. And I had no patience for it.
Yeah, because a lot of the construct of this movie is because the husband dies, but then he, quotations, kind of comes back to life in the manifest of like this kind of ghost being who kind of prods her and along, while another version of herself is there, kind of. It almost works as this kind of angel and devil on the shoulder type thing.
But it's ultimately a lazy plot device because they have nothing to do. They have nothing to use to tell this story other than that.
And I think also this is this is also a story that's predicated on having a twist that's supposed to really bring everything together and clarify everything. It does not. It's a very poorly constructed kind of half-assed lazy twist that even when I think about it now really just makes me crack up, because the fact that when they were writing this and they were going, this twist of the knife, this little 180 is really gonna blow their minds,
and it explains it to you while it's happening.
There's pretty much like. It's pretty much this represents. Yeah, Stephen King is coming. It's like he's Annie Halling us and just kind of coming out from behind something, going, "Hello, let me explain this." How this thing twisted up.
And our previous guest to the podcast, Sydney on Letterboxd, has a really good review of this movie where she explains what the film means to her and how she finds the twist to be ultimately very moving and redemptive. And her take on it is really good, but that was not my experience watching the movie at all. Again, that feels like the problems of the movie's failure to actually tell a story compressed and amplified by 10 times in this very, very short time span. And if you've seen the movie, you know what we're talking about. If you haven't seen the movie, we should not explain it because the movie takes a complete 180, but the 180 direction that it takes does not work in any way.
So Gerald's Game, it's on Netflix now, so you can view it however you'd like. But it's just it's. I mean, I would say it's a big hit for Stephen King, but he has 1,500 other adaptations this year, so it's
a lot of the fans of this movie are people who have read the book and find that this is one of the truest adaptations of King. And as somebody who's never read Stephen King and have only seen many Stephen King movies, I don't think this works as a movie. It might be a faithful adaptation of King's novel, but that doesn't mean it's a good movie.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Nathan, you attended a number of screenings at the New York Film Festival, so I'm kind of curious to see your report back on some of the stuff that you liked from it.
Yeah, so I guess 2 episodes ago now, I talked about the first film I saw at the New York Film Festival, Lucretia Martel's Zama, and basically everything else I saw in the festival was the weekend after that, October 7th through 8th. I basically, for the majority of the festival, stayed in the projections section, which was sponsored by Mubi. And basically, projections is the experimental avant-garde section of the festival with a few features every year, but mostly a bunch of shorts programs, and there were I attended 3 of the actual projections programs, and then one specific filmmaker, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And I also saw the new documentary Tonsler Park by Kevin Jerome Everson, which I will also talk about briefly. But just to run you through some of the highlights of the projections programs I attended, there were some films that I was not crazy about, but just for the sake of time, and also just because I don't want to devote my life to bashing the passion projects of experimental filmmakers. That seems very unnecessary. I will only talk about the ones that I liked. So really one of the most amazing experimental films I've ever seen is called Saint Bathan's Repetitions by Alexander LaRose. And I had not really read the notes for this program while going into it. I just kind of knew names of filmmakers and saw some images and was interested. But basically what this film is, it was projected on 16 millimeter, which is what it was shot on. And it's this like series of repeated scenarios of a man walking into this old house and opening the door and sitting down. And it plays first in this incredibly just like beyond grainy, like distorted, just almost like disgusting, abrased film that is just like utterly ghostly, and you cannot tell what it is at first, but slowly this figure starts to emerge, and you have basically the same shot kind of layered over itself over and over and over again. So the actual space of the room and everything in it is static, but the man who's moving throughout the frame is like just this like whisper of a person just over himself, like I don't know how many times. And so he's kind of like moving at different points in time on the screen, and then it sort of repeats but slightly differently in color and goes back and forth between the black and white and the color, and approaches the same kind of action from different angles and perspectives. And it was just a film where, for me, a lot of times, because though I may have seen more experimental and AG films than the average person, I still feel like I'm not really confident in it still, and I'm learning a lot more. And so a lot of times the films that I respond to the most are not films that I can really articulate, but films that I just watch them and I'm like, I have no idea how they created this effect and did this thing formally. And this was definitely a film where I felt like that. And I think a lot of it too had to do with the fact that it was projected on the actual print of the film, and like the original copy, I think, added a lot to it. Another short in that same program that I felt similarly about, where I was just like, I don't know what this is, like, I don't know how this was made, is called On Generation and Corruption by Takashi Makino, which is taken from a treatise by Aristotle, the title is. But it's just these like images of Tokyo, just urban sites throughout Tokyo superimposed over each other and kind of distorted, and the colors are altered, and you're just like watching it and you kind of see traces of figures, but you're not really sure what they are. You can't see clearly. You kind of at a certain point start to feel like maybe you're imagining these figures, and maybe you're just like trying to create a pattern out of the light and the color. And it's like 25 minutes long maybe, but it was kind of to a point I wasn't bored necessarily, but I just felt totally unstuck from time and had no idea how long the film had been going on for, how much longer was left in it, where I was in time exactly. It was just kind of like one of those experiences, which sounds, I don't know, sometimes you can watch a film like that and it's just utterly boring, or you really feel the time and it's kind of this alienating experience. But for me, I just felt like I was just floating and enjoy that experience. Andrew, you're just laughing at me.
I'm picturing David Allen's reaction to you talking about feeling unstuck in time and floating in space while watching these movies.
I'm sorry. I have my tastes, and that's my taste.
I will say that I have felt similarly watching many of the avant-garde films programmed by Public Cinema here in Knoxville. So, I mean, I do think that is one of the more satisfying reactions to have to an avant-garde film is just to feel like you're in a completely different space.
For sure. And the next film in the series is kind of a different. Well, it's on one hand, it's similar in that it's taking a familiar thing and making you look at it in a different way, but it's also like very familiar and very easy to figure out, I think. And that is Wasteland #1, Ardent and Verdant, the new film from Jody Mack, who's one of my favorite filmmakers working today.
Nice.
I've talked about on the podcast before. She has a really sensational feature called Dusty Stacks of Mom, which is the stop motion musical documentary. And this new film is very short and it's very simple. It's just these kind of like alternating images of circuit boards and microchips, and then these kind of cutting back and forth with these like super saturated, contrast heavy images of poppy fields taken off the internet. And I don't know. It's, that's kind of a simple concept, but I think that it's really interesting in how it's kind of like looking at microchips and these really technical objects as a sort of landscape and as a sort of textured object. And so it's not just saying like, here's technology, here's nature. It's kind of like, let's look at technology as nature, and let's look at images of nature as things that are both captured from the real world and produced and altered by technology. So it's, it presents itself as being like nature versus man machine, but I think it's a little bit more than that. And it's also just, as always the case with Jody Mack's work, just like very enjoyable and a real delight to look at, and very fun, and shows that like avant-garde film can be fun and colorful and kind of delightful.
Man, I wish Jody Mack would get a distribution deal. I really want to own a copy of Dusty Stacks of Mom.
Yeah.
And want to be able to see all of her shorts.
It would be nice to have just like a complete DVD of her stuff. Just to show to more people, because I think it's a good introduction to kind of the possibility of experimental filmmaking in a way that maybe confronts kind of like the normal preconceptions that we have of it.
I know that a bunch of Jody Mack shorts are on Fandor, or at least they used to be. So even though you probably can't go out and see the one that Nathan's talking about, go on Fandor and watch some
and
Jody Mack
there's
stuff.
Also a lot on
really
Vimeo
fun.
too that are just kind of up for free.
Nice. Yes.
So yeah, and the next two films that I saw in the projection program kind of do something similar, where there's an element of play to them, or kind of almost an element of like genre convention or familiarity. The first of those films is Ride Like Lightning, Crash Like Thunder by the filmmaker Fern Silva. And this is basically a reflection on the kind of mythological and mystical history of the Hudson Valley in New York, and is sort of reflecting on the legend of Rip Van Winkle and also the landscape painters of the Hudson River School. And that's not a region that I'm super familiar with. I don't really know a lot about the history of that area, but I do know it's very gorgeous. You have these like, these just rich green trees, and it's just this like, kind of, it's shot on 16 millimeter, and that really helps the color of it and just brings out this kind of fall texture to it. But this movie is also interesting in that it uses a lot of like samples from pop songs just kind of playing in the backgrounds of spaces, and this also has this like throbbing minimalist techno score, and then at the same time kind of uses imagery from horror movies. There's this like really sort of fake special effect hand that will just creep from behind walls and like lampposts and stuff, and it's kind of funny but also a little uncomfortable and disarming, and it's supposed to be this kind of like creeping hand of history in a very literal tongue-in-cheek way. And so it's this reflection on sort of 19th century storytelling and art, but almost presented as like an Iron Maiden album cover, I guess. So I don't know. I like that. That's another thing that really appeals to me about certain avant-garde filmmakers, is that mixture of the familiar and the recognizable, and sort of the more uncanny, the more defamiliarized, which really is, I think, maybe the best way to explain the kind of the highlight of the projections programs for me, which was a short called Onward Lossless Follows, which is the latest short film by Michael Robinson, who is maybe like top
Nice.
5, top 10 filmmakers, experimental or otherwise, working for me right now.
He's so good. People need to, again, go on Fandor and watch like all the Michael Robinson stuff,
And
especially Light is Waiting, which is...
most of it is on Vimeo too.
Yeah, so how's the new Michael Robinson?
So it's kind of continuing in, if you go watch any of his stuff, it's like a very, for the most part, identifiable style, like taking these artifacts from kind of 90s, 2000s pop culture and imbuing them with this like really spiritual, transcendent quality, but also there's like a kind of undercurrent of darkness to a lot of it. So this film starts off with this like preacher's voiceover about looking up at the stars and like trying to I don't know, like escape in the stars, and it's this very sort of sad sermon, and there's images that almost like remind me of Twin Peaks season 3, and that they have this kind of like atomic age Bruce Conner sort of stars and space look to them. But then it takes this just like left, and it uses these stock images of stock videos from Getty Images of women like looking at laptops and then like raising their hands just like in delight and in like exclamation. And
are they actually from Getty Images?
Yeah,
we know that for a fact.
They are. 'Cause in the Q&A afterwards, somebody asked Michael Robinson about that, and he was like, "Well, I was really interested in seeing how many images of just like ecstatic women there were looking at laptops, and there were none of men. All of the ones of men are like men clenching a fist and looking very serious at their computer, but with the images of women and laptops." And he was like he talked about this quote sense of laptopness, which I thought was just like a really funny word to use. And friend of the podcast and occasional guest Darren Hughes of the Public Cinema was actually in town and was sitting in the row behind me, and I just heard him start laughing at the word laptopness. But so yeah, it's like using these kind of just almost spiritual, like weird images, and then it takes this left turn and has this footage from some kind of like stranger danger PSA, where like this woman is trying to convince this kid to get in the car with her, and you see these subtitles of the dialogue, and then when the video ends and it goes to this like other footage, the conversation and the subtitles keeps going and changes into a text conversation, and you find out that actually like in this narrative that is constructed, this woman and the child she's trying to pick up are like lovers. They're like secret lovers. And then there's like another part of the stranger danger PSA played again where the kid actually gets in the car with the woman, and it's like, on the one hand, describing that sounds super uncomfortable, but there's something about it where it's like becomes disarmingly genuine and romantic in a strange way that like, you know, has that darkness to it, but also it's like there's this spiritual escape for these people through this relationship that is constructed through public service announcements and texting. And there's also like this insane moment where there's like a cover of Horse with No Name by America playing over distorted images of a horse being airlifted out of a forest, and there's like an instrumental cover of a Lana Del Rey song at one point. And so that's ultimately the thing that I find that I really love about Michael Robinson's work, is how sort of like affirming it is to the spiritual and transcendent qualities of air quotes lowbrow popular culture, and that there are these avenues for joy and for rapture in these things that we may disregard. And there's also a sense of humor to that too, where a lot of these moments you can either take as like overwhelmingly sincere or as being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and I always kind of like that.
Talk about another guy who needs a Blu-ray anthology set. I need to own all the Michael Robinson shorts.
So that was most of the projections program. I also saw a short of films by the painter Mike Henderson, who started making movies as a kind of a side project in the 70s and into the 80s and maybe beyond that. I don't know. He's still alive, and he did a great Q&A after. And his films have just been restored by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and they're all just these amazing kind of like improvised, very funny investigations of art and language. There's a great short film that's like a retelling of The Last Supper that reminds me of some of John Waters' early work. There's some just like great physical comedy. And because those have been restored, I'm hoping that they will get some kind of like DVD, home video release or otherwise availability to the larger world, because they were just really enjoyable. And another kind of experimental filmmaking that is fun and more accessible, and that kind of proves, I don't know, the worth of avant-garde filmmaking to people who might be otherwise skeptical or doubtful of it. Unfortunately, just for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about Tonsler Park, the documentary from Kevin Jerome Everson, but it's a movie that I think is worth seeing. But
you saw a feature.
I did.
By Hong Sang-soo.
Yeah, that is
Q&A.
what I was going to talk about. The U.S. premiere of The Day After, I guess the 21st or 22nd movie by Hong Sang-soo. I mean, he's just been working on it on an incredible pace like nobody else. And
how many years has he been working
since
total?
the late 90s, early 2000s. But it's like Dennis Lim, the director of programming at Lincoln Center, introduced The Day After and hosted a Q&A with director Hong after. And he said that the last time that Hong was at the New York Film Festival was in 2010 with Oki's movie, which I think he said was like his 12th movie. And yeah, he just completed the 19th, 20th, and 21st features in his filmography this year.
I saw somebody tweet that during the Q&A, somebody asked him how long it takes him to edit his movies, and he said a day, usually.
Yeah, he seems like someone who, I mean, he says that he writes every morning. Like, he just will write a scene in the morning, then give the pages to the actors, and they have an hour or so to memorize each scene. But you know, the thing about him is a lot of people have compared him to Eric Rohmer and to Woody Allen as these directors who are kind of interested in these sort of, I guess, emotionally stunted men who work in the arts, and they're sort of, a lot of the films are kind of a similar wavelength and of a similar scenario. But what's really interesting about Hong is how he really plays with repetition itself, and each film generally will repeat scenes or have a sort of fragmented structure. Like Right Now, Wrong Then, which came out last year, which I think is maybe, of the films I've seen of his, maybe his first or second best, starts over halfway through the movie and gets, sort of retells in these very subtle ways the events you've seen in the first half through a different perspective. So The Day After is he had two films in the festival, On the Beach at Night Alone and The Day After, which both have his kind of now like creative partner, but also life partner, Kim Min-hee, who you might know from Park Chan-wook's The Handmaiden, and who is just like, I'm sorry, but like one of the most beautiful actors in movies that I feel like I've ever seen.
You don't have to apologize for that.
Yeah, I just had to put that out there. And she's just like,
Wasn't there also a screening of Claire's Camera, which stars her and Isabelle Huppert?
Not at the New York Film Festival, but both Claire's Camera and The Day After premiered at Cannes. And The Day After, of these three new Hong movies, is the only one I think it still doesn't have distribution. So that's why I chose to saw it, because On the Beach at Night Alone is coming out later this year and Claire's Camera is coming out next year. So I knew I would be able to see those. His movie before these three, Yourself and Yours, didn't get picked up. So the kind of the fate of that movie is just dangling, and unless you want to torrent it,
one of the issues of a guy like Hong who puts out 3 movies a year. He can't get distribution for all of them, and so people just can't see them.
But I think that it's like he's getting to a point now where his profile is just growing and growing with each movie, especially now working with a lot of these kind of like bigger international stars, like Huppert and Kim Min-hee. And so I think he's, it's like they're better. The odds for each movie is better and better. But this one I liked, but was not one of my favorites among his films necessarily. It is about the head of a publishing company who is middle-aged, and he's married and is sort of unhappy in his marriage. And you find out that he had an affair, this really kind of passionate affair with his the only other person who worked with him in his office. And after his wife found out about the affair, he and this woman split things up, and she stopped working at the publishing company, and he hires a new woman played by Kim Min-hee to fill her place. And it's kind of got this structure where you're sort of trying to piece together when exactly some things happened. And this was the first time I'd watched one of Hong's movies with an audience, and that accentuated both how funny his movies are and also how deeply, deeply uncomfortable and cringeworthy they are. Just like in this one especially, you're just watching some of the most like emotionally stunted conversations where just like these people are having arguments that don't really go anywhere, and you're just like, I don't know, like starting to kind of sweat and just like so that it was interesting to have that drawn out, and definitely added to the film for me, but I can see why it may not be other people's thing. And I don't know. I this one doesn't necessarily repeat in the same way that like Right Now Wrong Then does. It does kind of draw connections between scenes and have scenes out of order, but I just didn't find that structural conceit as interesting. And I also didn't, with the exception of the character that Kim Min-hee plays, because she brings in this kind of element of faith and religion that I haven't really picked up on as much in Hong's work, because she is this woman who believes in God, and she says she feels like people in the literary world judge her for that, or would judge her for that if they knew that she was a kind of a person of faith. And I think that's sort of an interesting element to bring in. And I think she's also one of those great actresses. My friend Graham said that Hong shoots Kim Min-hee like Joseph von Sternberg shot Marlene Dietrich, and I definitely see that. And I also see a sort of connection in acting styles between Dietrich and Kim, where like sort of in The Scarlet Empress by Joseph von Sternberg, which is maybe my favorite movie of his, where Dietrich in that movie like starts off as this character who you think is very naive, but then sort of on a dime just becomes really complex and really assertive and aware of themselves and their environment and in control. A similar thing sort of happens with the character that Kim Min-hee is playing in this one. So I think for her performance alone, this is definitely worth seeing, and I definitely like it, but it's not one of my favorites among his movies. But I also think sometimes his movies take some kind of like thinking about and ruminating on. So that was my experience at the New York Film Festival. It's a great film festival with a really kind of good, if you want the best of like every festival that happens in the year, without having to go to Cannes or Toronto or Venice or where else, you can kind of get it at the New York Film Festival with some added bonuses too.
Were they playing a lot of the same stuff that Darren talked about with the TIFF Film Festival a couple of weeks ago? Things like, I don't know, Lady Bird and First Reformed and things like that.
They did a surprise extra screening of First Reformed, which I was bummed I couldn't go to. But yeah, they had like Faces, Places, Lady Bird, Wonderstruck, a lot of things that have already premiered other places. So there has been kind of a lot of discussion about that, especially because a lot of these movies are opening this year or opening like in a week. Like Faces, Places, and The Florida Project both played at NYFF and both opened several days later in New York and elsewhere too. And so there is kind of this question of like, how is this the best possible programming? But at the same time, it's like the quality is there's no question about the quality of the films overall. It's just kind of like,
what's the best use of your time while you have
the best use of your time and your money when like these movies will be coming out and you don't want to pay like $25 to go to the premiere, or at least the US premiere. Like, I don't know. It's kind of, it's one of those things where it's like, it can be a very rewarding experience, but there are also reasons to maybe not see certain films or buy a full festival pass or whatever. I think most people that I know, unless they had press passes, just kind of like sampled and didn't do like a full kind of badge or anything. So.
Okay. Well, I guess the day after, hopefully we'll get some, I think, was it Grasshoppers distributing it?
I don't know. I don't think they are. I know that Clear's Camera and On the Beach at Night Alone are being distributed both by Cinema Guild. I think the kind of fate of the day after is up in the air, though I heard something that sounded like it had been picked up, but I don't know by who off the top of my head.
Oh, okay.
So.
Yeah, well, it could be appearing at some point this year, maybe next. But we're going to take a quick break. We will be back talking 1992's Candyman after this.
Hey, Cinematariats. This is your co-host Lydia Creech with an important message during this break in the show. Cinematary would like you to know that we do not want your money, and we don't want to place ads in the show at this time either. That's not why we do this. We do it because we enjoy each other's company, and we want to bring you our pure, unadulterated opinions on the world of cinema. However, there are a few things you can do to help out the show that we would greatly appreciate. First, leave us a review on iTunes, 4 or 5 stars only, to help us reach more listeners per the algorithm gods. Secondly, send us a tweet at Cinematary, or better yet, send us an email at zach@cinematary.com. That's Zach, Z-A-C-H, so we can hear from you guys for a change. I'd especially like to hear if you're a human and not an android who also likes Blade Runner, or maybe you have a suggestion of a movie you would really like to hear our opinions on. Regardless, let us know your thoughts and we will read them out and respond to them on future episodes of the show. Finally, please share the show with friends and members of your family who you think would enjoy listening to and participating in our film discussions that we bring to you guys every week. So, to recap, review, send us your thoughts through Twitter and email, and please share with your friends and family. We would greatly appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Now back to the show.
Episode 166 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be continuing our October horror series with 1992's Candyman. It was written and directed by Bernard Rose, and the film stars Virginia Madsen, Tony Todd, Xander Berkeley, and Casey Lemons. And it's based on the short story The Forbidden by Clive Barker, but the setting was changed from England to the Cabrini Green public housing development in Chicago and follows a graduate student played by Madsen completing a thesis on urban legends who encounters the legend of Candyman, an artist and son of a slave who had his hand severed and was then murdered. I like how they severed the hand and then murdered him. Although Barker's short story is set in his native Liverpool, Rose decided, quote, that the film would be much better done in the U.S. Assisted by members of the Illinois Film Commission, Rose scouted locations in Chicago and found Cabrini Green, quote, an incredible arena for a horror movie because it was a place of such palpable fear. Rose once said in an interview with The Independent that he found filming in Chicago easier than filming in England. I found this to be super interesting. Eddie Murphy was the original choice for the role of Candyman, but the filmmakers could not afford him.
Oh my gosh.
According to Todd, quote, I met with Bernard Rose, who's a brilliant mind and a great director, and I wanted to say it was a hire, but people kept telling me, oh, you'll never be able to shake this. And I said, I'm going to do the best I can and go away from that. I knew when I read it and I saw the bees and the stuff, I knew things like they had that haven't been filmed before, so that was interesting. I always wanted to find my own personal Phantom of the Opera. Yeah, I thought the note that Eddie Murphy was the original choice, that would have just been a drastically different movie.
I don't know if I'd be able to take it seriously.
Vampire in Brooklyn,
Yeah, that's true.
Maybe we wouldn't have gotten that movie.
There was some controversy that the film was depicting racism and racial stereotypes. According to Rose, quote, I had to go and have a whole set of meetings with the NAACP because the producers were so worried. And what they said to me when they'd read the script was, why are we even having this meeting? This is just good fun. Their argument was, why shouldn't a black actor be a ghost? Why shouldn't a black actor play Freddy Krueger or Hannibal Lecter? If you're saying that they can't be, it's really perverse. This is a horror movie.
I don't know if good fun is the word that I would use.
Yeah, this is not a fun movie.
It's pretty dark.
According to Madsen, quote, I was and am now worried about how people will respond. I don't think Spike Lee will like this film.
Do we know what Spike Lee thought of this film?
I don't know. I never found what Spike Lee thought of this movie.
I'm going to Google it.
Okay. Philip Glass composed the score, according to him, quote, it has become a classic, so I still make money from that score. Get checks every year. I like how that had nothing to do really with the craft of the score. It was just he was making some bank on it. Candyman spawned 2 sequels, Candyman Farewell to the Flesh and Candyman Day of the Dead, neither of which performed critically and commercially as well as the first. The New York Times said Candyman is set up as an elaborate campfire story. More than once it is said that what someone witnessed turned his or her hair white with shock. They went on to say, late in the story, both stars are required to play a kiss scene involving mouthfuls of bees. Bees loom large in Candyman's troubled history. Whatever these actors were paid, it wasn't enough. Variety said, working from a story originally set in Liverpool by horror meister Clive Barker, Britt Helmer, Bernard Rose provides plenty of jolts, both bogus and actual, along the way. Threat of Candyman bursting out from behind mirrors is ever present, and his evisceration technique with his hook is particularly gruesome. Performances are unusually credible for this sort of fare. In 1992, Ebert said, urban legends tap our deepest fears, and one of the most subterranean involves the call for help that is laughed at or ignored. We cry out again and again, only to be dismissed by our friends or the 911 operator or strangers on the shore. He continued, Rose evokes Hitchcock's favorite formula, the innocent victim wrongly accused. Just as the Candyman's victim called 911 and was not believed, so Madsen is arrested by the police and her story scornfully dismissed. It's all kind of intriguing. Elements of the plot may not hold up in the clear light of day, but that didn't bother me much. What I liked was a horror movie that was scaring me with ideas and gore instead of simply with gore. So yeah, what did you guys think of Candyman? I think the first thing I'm curious about is how do you compare this to? I mean, they're different, but at the same time have a lot of similarities. But this to like Nightmare on Elm Street, where you kind of have these figures that appear and take out characters gruesomely. I know Nathan, you're much more well versed in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. I mean, do you see any comparisons between the two?
I mean, I think that Candyman continues on a similar wavelength with, I don't know, more like the first and second Nightmare on Elm Street films, which I think the second one is the best, and maybe this is heretical or blasphemy. As much as I love Wes Craven, I don't actually think that the Wes Craven Nightmare movies are the best ones. So I feel like Candyman sort of continues on that more serious, more spiritual, and also more I don't know if this is the right word, but more like erotic Nightmare on Elm Street movies, and not so much the kind of popular imagination of Freddy Krueger as this like prankster who has all these crazy sight gags and then one-liners, which I love that stuff. I'm a sucker for that stuff. but I also, I'm interested in the other kind of subtext of those movies too. So I think I think that comparison is definitely, there's something to that.
Well, that's just what I was what I was just kind of thinking of while watching it, because they, at least in terms of how they structure the kills and the kind of horror elements, it seems like they, at least there's some sort of shared, style.
And they're both very much about these sort of buried subconscious, unconscious urges, and in the case of Candyman, that's very much about this like hidden history and hidden trauma that has been sort of suppressed but still lives on through these rumors and urban legends and graffiti on bathroom walls and whatever. It's very fascinating to me just to look at this movie as like insane that there was a time when there were, not to be particularly down about the state of movies right now, but also to be a little bit down about the state of movies right now, that there were just kind of like mid-level studio horror movies that were like this interesting on a formal level and have this kind of really distinctive Philip Glass score and just like all of these very consciously framed shots, and I don't know, that's interesting. And also that this is a horror movie that's about academics and basically about academic, obsessions really destroying you and driving you insane, because you can get invested in these rabbit holes that ultimately really lead to nowhere or lead to your own kind of demise. And also, since so much of academia is wrapped up in this really uncomfortable anthropological, like white people looking at non-white people and writing about them in these very problematic and offensive and just messed up ways. There's a whole history of that, a strong, deep history. And so it's interesting that this is just like a studio horror movie that is so much about this kind of like intellectual horror, I guess, even if it is very gory too.
But yeah, definitely an academic inquiry into historical racism. It's unbelievable to think of a studio movie that takes that as its basic premise.
It's so weird.
Did you guys feel any sort of... I mean, Ebert mentioned in his review that there are things about this that remind him of Hitchcock, specifically the victim wrongly accused archetype. But did anybody just feel like you were watching a Hitchcock movie while you were watching this? Like, specifically our main character as this archetypal Hitchcock blonde and following her investigative journey, just wandering through hallways and like taking notes about things. I felt like I was watching Marnie or The Birds or the first third of Psycho or something like that. And I know this is a movie that is coming out 30 years after most of that stuff, but it really felt like a time capsule.
There was sort of a point in the film where I was like, I mean, you guys know that I love Brian De Palma, and I was kind of like, I feel like Brian De Palma could have almost directed this movie just because it is so concerned with like watching and observation and these illusions and images, which, obviously Hitchcock, De Palma, this incestuous relationship. But like during the scene when she finally gives in to the Candyman and there's that, like classic, like Vertigo sort of sweeping circular kiss scene that is recast, as this strange, like intercosmic romance from beyond the grave. I don't know. And also too, that's like the kind of relationship between Candyman and what is her name again? What is her name? The Virginia Madsen character. Helen. That they're both sort of like operating on these kind of illusions that they have of one another. Like she has this sort of idea that like the Candyman is not real, or like the Candyman is this, the Candyman is that. And he's like, no, I am very real. I am very physical. You didn't believe me, so I have to show myself to you and shatter that illusion. And on the inverse, like she comes to represent to him this, like in classic Hitchcock style, this like perfect, pure, virginal beauty. Yeah. But there's this racial element that is not there in Hitchcock.
Right. I mean, you have this this victim of slavery era racism, who the story that we get about him is that he, impregnated a white woman and therefore was punished for that. And just looking at the historical record, like a lot of the quote unquote justification of the Ku Klux Klan and things like that were trying to protect the white race from what's the word? The word of like muddying, quote unquote muddying the bloodline.
Diluting?
There's another word for it. But anyways, like any sort of diluting of the quote-unquote pure white bloodline was used as justification for violence against people of color. The fact that you would have this very pale, very blonde white woman protagonist who eventually gets framed as being complicit and maybe even the cause of the trauma that the villain has experienced by the end is really subversive.
Especially when you have a scene that later in the film she's attacked by people, and I was kind of like, she gets away with just being, I guess, beat up and kind of left, for dead or whatever. But I don't know. It seemed like I don't know. It seemed much more subdued than. I don't know what you would expect in this situation where she's kind of backed into I don't know, it seems like violence that it's almost PG violence.
A lot of the violence just happens. Yeah. It isn't lingered upon. There's no like close-ups of gore or anything like that. A lot of times when somebody is stabbed, for example, Bernard Rose cuts away not only to somewhere else in the room, but another room entirely. He'll cut away to this weird, cosmic, dark apartment on the other side of town where Candyman lives, and we just get a glimpse of that every time there's an act of violence. I don't know, maybe that's just a Clive Barker thing, and there's a lot of like cosmic mythological elements in the Hellraiser movies, but I've not seen those, so I can't really comment on it.
Well, I also, for me, one of the key lines in this movie, and the only way I can really sort of think about it without thinking that maybe it's like not the best in terms of what it's depicting, I don't know, because it is a sort of complicated movie, and I'm still, after having seen it twice now, unclear as to what exactly it's sort of saying, but. Yeah, there's that scene when Helen first goes to the apartment and she meets the mother, Anne Marie, and Anne Marie says, like, anytime white people come here, they just stir up trouble, which is what happens. And I don't think we are supposed to really like be sympathetic to Helen necessarily, and like not supposed to root for her. But at the same time, it's like I don't really know what to make of the Candyman either, because I don't entirely think we're supposed to root for him, and I don't know. I know I 100% agree with you, because that's something that I definitely was wrestling with this movie. Is when going in, I felt like it was going to possibly tackle the issue of race much more explicitly, and it kind of felt to me like it was. I mean, it felt like a movie that had a good number of black characters that was situated in a black community that was directed by a white person.
Written by a white person.
It seemed like, I don't think Bernard Rose was. I don't think he was ignorant of things. I don't think or he wasn't. like explicitly ignoring things. I think he was trying to engage in that whole area of Chicago, but I don't think he was equipped enough.
I think he's basing it on a lot of stereotypes.
Exactly.
Like the literal depiction of the projects is ridiculous in this movie. Every hallway, every doorway is covered in graffiti.
Yeah.
And that like the worst neighborhood is not like that.
Yeah, it just doesn't. Yeah, it never felt like it was like there was. I never felt like it was genuine in the setting. And I kind of was upset with that because I thought I thought I was going to be getting more of that out of this movie, and it just kind of left me, empty to a lot of the possibilities that I felt like it could have engaged with.
The only moment where I feel like you get something a little more subtle from the depiction of Black characters and the community that it's showing and the kind of urban environment is when you actually go into Anne Marie's apartment and it's like, it's not run down or it's this home that is very clearly cared for and put together, and she's, trying to provide all the things that her son needs. I think that is like one of the more interesting moments, but yeah, everything else feels like Bernard Rose and Clive Barker just like listened to The Message by Grandmaster Flash and like put in all these things, just like drugs, graffiti, it's bad. Yeah. And like, that's it. And it's not necessarily like, the most horrific stereotypes that have ever been put to film or anything, but it is a certain type of stereotype. And it's just frustrating. That's like, if, in the 90s, if like Ernest Dickerson, or if today, like Jordan Peele or the Black directors that have really kind of made these horror films that actually productively and intently engage with this kind of social commentary regarding race and regarding kind of the connection between race and place, and also like in Get Out, the connection, very clearly between white and black, as like, if it were done kind of with more care and thought to that, and also probably by a Black writer, director, I think there would be more of that subtlety that it really needs. Otherwise, it's like I enjoyed this movie visually, and I don't know, find something about the relationship, like when it becomes this weird romantic but not really Hitchcock relationship, when it's really doing that, I like that a lot. But yeah, it's other ways that's not very productive.
No, I think you make a good point in terms of comparing this to Get Out, which I think that just shows that having, a Black director and writer behind, in charge of the movie it just adds this level of understanding of just every little nook and cranny of how this, how the community they're creating would react and interact and do all that. Just kind of felt stilted and staged and kind of taken from an after school special. I just felt like there was a lot of that there, and it kind of felt like they were engaging with it on the level that Bernard Rose and the other producers were able to understand it. But especially after seeing Get Out this year, I'm just like, there's so much you could be doing so much more with this.
It seems like it's coming from an academic understanding of systemic racism and not from a personal lived experience with it.
But even then, it's like there is historical kind of more structural systemic stuff that it hints at that I think it could do fascinating things, like with like when Helen is telling Bernadette the kind of like the story of her apartment versus this, Cabrini Green. Oh my
God, yeah. Like it's a horror movie about urban design almost for a minute.
That's fascinating. And like it's, when she looks into that other apartment, it starts to kind of like put these interesting ideas into play. But yeah, it doesn't, it kind of drops that interest in history and interest in actual environment. And then I feel like you have this sort of lack of, I don't know, it like doesn't really take the Black characters as individual people. Like there's like at Helen's funeral, you have everyone who lives in the building come together in this long procession. like,
it just feels
wearing
like
their
every
Sunday
black
best.
person who exists comes to her funeral.
And it's just like, it's just like, oh, like the black community just showed up to her funeral, kind of en
Every
masse.
black person in Chicago, we're going to Helen's funeral.
Which kind of shows how the way that the writer and director are engaging with this community as ideas as opposed to people and characters. I think that it's an interesting idea to frame this story, or I guess center this story around a white woman, specifically in the way that, white femininity has been linked to fears about miscegenation and things like that. Miscegenation was the word I was looking for earlier, by the way. But I don't actually care or am interested in Helen's character. I'm interested in her as a cipher or an interloper into the world of the Candyman and the world of that housing project. And for the first half of the movie, I think she functions in that way really well, of just kind of exploring like a Hitchcock character would, and showing us all these locations and interacting with all these really interesting characters. In the second half, when it becomes all about her and this descent into madness story, I have not been I have not been kind of programmed to care about that element of the movie, and it loses me for a good 20 to 30 minutes until it comes back around to the mythology of the Candyman at the end.
Yeah, it just it becomes all about her relationship with with her husband, played by Xander Berkeley.
Yeah,
and it's like,
why the fuck does that matter?
I really like Xander Berkeley as an actor who just appears in things, and it's just this reassuring presence. Maybe because I watched a lot of 24 as a kid.
I watched.
Was on there.
I'm familiar with him from Safe, and he is not a reassuring presence in that movie.
And Air Force One too. He's good in that. He's just one of those good, just character kind of journeyman actors who just shows up. But it's like, it's there's that scene at the scene at the end where Helen gets her revenge, and I'm like, this has nothing at all to do with sort of the larger issues and story at play. And I don't really it's terrible that her husband is a scumbag and she's being cheated on with this college student, but then it's like, how am I supposed to feel about her? Because in the first half, she's this really sort of complicated, cipher who I'm not, I understand that I'm not supposed to kind of necessarily fully sympathize with her. I'm supposed to recognize the things she does that are not good. But then it becomes about her story of personal revenge, and I'm like, wait, am I supposed to like her? Right. Sympathize?
There are parts at the end where she's framed as, like I said, guilty or complicit in the crimes against the Candyman in a grand historical sense. But there are other parts where it feels like she's being set up as a white savior character.
Yeah,
where she is literally saving a black baby from a burning fire, like a pile of rubble.
And she gives herself.
It doesn't feel like the movie is necessarily complicating the character or making us feel like there's some sort of moral ambiguity about the character. It is like she is literally 100% good and 100% bad at the same time. And that is a weird place where, like, a weird relationship that I have with the protagonist of this film.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree and piggyback on Nathan, what you were talking about, especially in that last sequence, because it you've spent this whole movie in kind of building up the mythology of Candyman and making her interact with him as a character and kind of engage into his world, and then this last scene is more just like a vengeful wife, like, I'm gonna get back at you cheated on me. And I felt like that, I just feel like that completely undercuts what she was leading up to as a character up to her death. It was almost like it was a whole other thing. But as we kind of wrap up, any closing thoughts on Candyman as a whole? Overall, did you enjoy it?
I definitely did. This is a movie that I've been meaning to get to for a really long time, and sadly it doesn't have an awesome home video distribution right now. You can probably find a used DVD somewhere, but it doesn't have a nice Blu-ray release or anything like that. So I've had a hard time getting my hands on it, and I was very glad to finally sit down with this thing. kind of to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, it is just crazy to think about this movie being greenlit and made in the time that it was greenlit and made. It's just so uniquely its own thing. Nothing about this movie seems like it could exist today. I mean, we do have movies like Get Out, but I feel like those are very different in terms of the content and the narrative being presented. They're much more firmly set in conventional genre tropes, whereas this again feels like a 60s Hitchcock movie in a lot of ways, and it has this vibrant look to it. I mean, everything is orange and yellow and brown, but it almost feels like it's glowing and gleaming the entire time. I really enjoy just watching this movie, like looking at the aesthetic of it. Whatever the political / racial implications are, I'm still very uncertain of. It's a movie that I may need to go back to later on and see if I've come to any conclusions after stewing on it for a little while. But it's such a singular thing that I definitely recommend everybody reckon with it for themselves.
Mm-hmm. I do think it is one of those movies that you can sort of allows for multiple readings just because it is so ambiguous. And so I'm sure there are people, many people who did think it was racist and offensive. And there are other people who, I know who have kind of taken more positive readings and more subversive readings out of it. So I think it's you can bring your own stuff to it and read into it a variety of ways. But like you were saying, it is just a very nice aesthetic experience, and it has, in addition to some of the visual qualities you mentioned, I feel like this really chilly kind of fall 90s quality, like Silence of the Lambs or almost even like the X-Files or something, where there's something about it that's just so crisp and very careful and very precise, but has these nice warm colors to it, even though it does have some crazy gore and like all the bee stuff, which I think the kind of the opening with the bees just buzzing and the voiceover is so awesome. So yeah, it is a very handsome, like well composed movie that I feel comfortable recommending it, but I also know it's like, I don't want to like put the full stamp of approval on it, but you can watch it. And also it has me more intrigued in Clive Barker's larger work.
We've mentioned it a little bit. I'd like to really point out the Philip Glass score.
Oh my god, it's so good.
I was laughing.
Why have we not talked about that the whole time?
I was laughing. I told Andrew when I watched this, halfway through the movie, I'm like, who did this score? I love this Philip Glass like score that they have for this movie. And then I look at the IMDb and I was like, oh, it's because it's Philip Glass. Okay. But yeah, it's such a lovely score. It reminds me a lot of the work he did for the Spider-Man movies, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. Just this kind of lyricalness that just kind of flows, that has this a little bit of uncertainty to it, but also kind of carries you through each sequence. I really, really loved the work that he did for this movie.
It's also very hard not to think about is it Pruitt Ego or Pruitt Igo?
Yeah.
Scene from Koyaanisqatsi.
Definitely.
With how you were interacting with this urban housing project in Candyman so intimately.
Yeah. Well, I believe that'll wrap up this episode. If you want to watch Candyman, it is kind of tough. I would recommend kind of poking around, seeing if your local library or something has it, because it's not really streaming anywhere.
Amazon VOD doesn't have it?
No, nobody. I really don't think anybody has it. So it's going to be.
I think it isn't it. Is it not available?
I think I saw that you could buy it for $10 on Vudu, whatever Vudu is.
It's one of those things, people
Go to your local pawn shop and look through the DVD stack.
Yeah, seriously. But yeah, this will wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/cinematary, on Twitter at handle @cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/cinematary, where we talk about we post all the movies that we talked about in this episode. Next week, we will be continuing our October horror series with 2001's Trouble Every Day.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited.
So yeah.
That's by Claire Denis, the director of Beau Travail. And it's a giallo movie, I think. There's a lot of blood in it.
Well, it has Vincent Gallo, Vincent Gallo.
Oh, there it is.
Perfect.
In there, so funny, sort of. Not
good.
Really a joke. That joke will probably appeal to an audience of like 4 people max. Wasn't even a joke. I'm sorry.
Thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.